I know what it feels like to stand on your own front porch and realize the key no longer fits. The lock was changed while I was at the cemetery burying my wife. My daughter watched from the window of the house I'd paid for 30 years. She had a plan. A single phone call from my attorney that afternoon undid every piece of it. This is what happens when grief meets greed, and one lawyer knows exactly what to say. This man spent 30 years building a home for his family. But when his wife died, his own daughter locked him out during the funeral. She thought she had won. She didn't know about the one phone call that would collapse her plan. What follows is a story about greed, grief, and the legal system's power to restore what was stolen. But the real story begins long before that funeral. It begins with a decision made years earlier, a decision that would come back to haunt everyone. The decision was made on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months before anyone died. The father, a retired electrician named Paul, sat across from his daughter Sarah at a diner in a small Ohio town. She had asked him to lunch. She had never asked him to lunch before. Over grilled cheese and iced tea, she said she wanted to help with the house. Mom was getting worse, she said. The stairs were too much. Maybe Paul could move into the ground floor bedroom and she could take over the upstairs. Just temporary. Just until things settled. Paul agreed. He didn't know that this was the first move in a quiet takeover. Over the next 12 weeks, Sarah insinuated herself into every aspect of her parents' life. She became the point of contact for the hospice nurse. She had the mail forwarded to her address. She convinced her mother to add her name to the bank account. And when Paul's wife passed away on a Wednesday in late October, Sarah was the one who made the funeral arrangements. She told Paul he didn't need to worry about anything. She would handle it. Paul trusted his daughter. He had no reason not to. But according to estate attorneys who handle these cases, this pattern is disturbingly common. A trusted family member slowly isolates the vulnerable person, takes control of finances, then strikes when grief leaves the survivor most disoriented. Financial elder abuse is one of the fastest-growing crimes in America, and in nearly 90% of cases, the perpetrator is a family member. On the morning of the funeral, Paul dressed in his best suit and drove with Sarah to the church. She was calm. She held his hand during the service. She cried at the graveside. And while Paul stood at his wife's grave, Sarah slipped away. She drove back to the house, let herself in with her copy of the key, and packed his things into garbage bags. She changed the locks. She called a locksmith to install a deadbolt with a code she didn't share. By the time Paul returned, his key no longer worked. He stood on his own front porch, still wearing his funeral suit, and watched through the window as his daughter sat in his living room, scrolling through his phone. He knocked, she didn't answer. He called her cell, she let it ring. Paul was 62 years old. He had lived in that house for 34 years. He had built the porch swing with his own hands. He had planted the oak tree in the front yard when his daughter was born. And now his daughter was sitting inside that house, treating him like a trespasser. The statistics on family estrangement are sobering. 27% of Americans are estranged from a family member. That's nearly 67 million people. The most common reason, betrayal. The second most common reason, money. In Paul's case, it was both. Sarah had convinced her mother to sign a power of attorney weeks before she died, and she had already started transferring assets. The house was next. But Paul had one thing Sarah didn't count on. He had a lawyer. That lawyer's name was Margaret Chen. She had handled Paul's will 5 years earlier. She knew the family dynamics. She had seen this coming. Paul called her from his son's house that evening. He explained what happened. Margaret listened without interrupting. Then she said 4 words that changed everything. Don't do anything rash. Margaret knew that under Ohio law, changing the locks on a co-owner without a court order is illegal. Paul was on the deed. His name was on the mortgage. Sarah had no legal right to exclude him. But getting him back in required a document called a writ of possession, and that required a court order. The next morning, Margaret filed an emergency motion for temporary restraining order and immediate access. She attached the deed, the property tax records, and an affidavit from Paul describing the lockout. Under Ohio civil procedure, a judge can grant an ex parte order against a family member who commits an illegal eviction. The hearing was set for 2 days later. Sarah didn't see it coming. She thought she had won. She had the keys. She had the house. She had the bank accounts. She even had her mother's jewelry in a safe deposit box, but she had forgotten one thing. The law favors the person on the deed. In the meantime, Paul spent 2 nights at his son's house, sleeping on a pull-out couch. His son was furious. He wanted to drive over and break the door down. Paul told him no. He had learned something in 34 years of marriage. When you're in the right, you let the law do the heavy lifting. On the morning of the hearing, Paul walked into the courthouse in the same suit he had worn to his wife's funeral. The judge was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and a no-nonsense expression. Sarah was already there, represented by a lawyer she had hired the day before. She looked confident. She looked like someone who believed she could talk her way out of anything. The hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. Sarah's lawyer argued that Paul had abandoned the property. He argued that Sarah had been caring for their mother alone for months, and that Paul had no right to return. He argued that Sarah had power of attorney. He argued that the house was essentially hers. The judge looked at the papers, then she looked at Paul. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "are you on the deed?" Paul said yes. "Do you have any other residence?" Paul said no. "Do you have any criminal history of domestic violence or threats against your daughter?" Paul said no. The judge turned to Sarah's lawyer. "Your client changed the locks on a joint owner without a court order. That's self-help eviction. It's illegal. I'm granting the emergency motion." And just like that, the lockout was reversed. But that wasn't the end of the story, because when Paul walked back into his house later that day, he found that Sarah had done more than just change the locks. She had emptied his wife's closet. She had removed the family photo albums. She had taken the contents of the safe. And she had filed a petition for guardianship of Paul, claiming he was no longer competent to manage his own affairs. The same daughter who locked him out of his own home was now trying to lock him out of his own life. And that's when things got really interesting. Paul had won the first battle, but Sarah had already started a war he didn't know existed. The guardianship petition arrived by certified mail 3 days after the lockout hearing. Paul opened it at his son's kitchen table, and the words didn't make sense at first. Sarah was claiming that Paul suffered from dementia, that he had a history of wandering, that he had been found confused and disoriented in his own neighborhood, that he was incapable of managing his finances or making medical decisions. She attached a letter from a doctor she had taken her mother to see, a physician who had never examined Paul. It was a lie, every word of it. But in the state of Ohio, a guardianship petition triggers an automatic investigation. A court-appointed evaluator would visit Paul's home, interview his family, and make a recommendation to the judge. If the evaluator found even a shred of evidence supporting Sarah's claims, Paul could lose control of his own life. This is how guardianship abuse works. It's a legal mechanism designed to protect vulnerable people, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. A family member files a petition, often without the subject's knowledge, and suddenly the burden of proof shifts. The accused must prove they are competent, not the accuser must prove they are not. It's a system that has been exploited across the country, with cases documented in every state. The National Guardianship Association estimates that thousands of petitions are filed each year based on false or exaggerated claims. Paul's attorney, Margaret Chen, knew this. She had seen it before, and she knew exactly how to fight it. "Paul," she told him over the phone, "I need you to do something. I need you to get a full neurological evaluation, independent, not connected to anyone Sarah knows, and I need you to start documenting everything." Paul made an appointment with a geriatric specialist in Columbus. He drove 2 hours each way. The evaluation took most of a day: cognitive tests, memory assessments, physical exams, interviews about his daily routine. The doctor asked him about his finances, his medications, his living situation. Paul answered every question honestly. He told the doctor about his wife's death, about the lockout, about the guardianship petition. The doctor's report was thorough. It concluded that Paul had no cognitive impairment beyond normal age-related changes. His memory was intact. His judgment was sound. He scored in the 92nd percentile for his age group on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. The doctor wrote, "There is no medical basis for guardianship. This patient is fully capable of managing his own affairs." Margaret filed the report with the court. She also filed a motion to dismiss the guardianship petition, arguing that it was filed in bad faith as a retaliatory act following the lockout reversal. But Sarah didn't back down. She hired a second lawyer, a specialist in elder law. She amended her petition to include allegations that Paul had been emotionally abusive to her mother, that he had isolated her from family, that he had mishandled her medical care during her final illness. She painted a picture of a controlling, vindictive man who needed to be stopped. The courtroom became a stage, and the audience was the judge. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Monday in December, just 2 months after the funeral. Paul walked into the same courthouse, the same room, but the atmosphere was different. This time, the stakes were higher. If he lost, he would lose more than his house. He would lose his independence. Sarah was already seated at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a sharp black suit, her hair pulled back. She looked like a prosecutor preparing for a conviction. Her lawyer was a man named David Strauss, known in elder law circles as aggressive and relentless. He had a reputation for bulldozing elderly defendants into settlement. Margaret sat beside Paul. She had prepared a binder of evidence, the independent medical evaluation, Paul's financial records showing he had managed his own accounts for decades, character letters from neighbors and friends, and most importantly, a paper trail of Sarah's actions during the months before her mother's death. The hearing began with Sarah's testimony. She spoke for nearly an hour. She described a father who was forgetful, who left the stove on, who couldn't remember his medications. She said she had found him wandering the neighborhood in his pajamas at midnight. She said she was terrified for his safety. Paul listened. He didn't interrupt, but he knew every word was a fabrication. Then Margaret cross-examined Sarah. She asked about the power of attorney. Sarah admitted she had it. She asked about the bank accounts. Sarah admitted she had transferred her mother's savings into her own name. She asked about the house. Sarah admitted she had changed the locks. "Did you consult your father before changing the locks?" Margaret asked. "No," Sarah said. "Did you give him any warning?" "No." "Did you have a court order?" "No." Margaret paused, letting the answers hang in the air. Then she asked, "Did you file the guardianship petition before or after your father regained access to the house?" Sarah hesitated. "After," she said quietly. "So the lockout failed, and then you decided to file for guardianship." "Objection," David Strauss said, leading. "Sustained," the judge said, but the point had been made. The next witness was Paul's son, Michael. He testified about his father's daily routine, his sharp memory, his ability to handle his own affairs. He described the lockout, the garbage bags, the humiliating moment when Paul had to sleep on a pull-out couch in his own son's house. "The day he found out about the guardianship petition," Michael said, "he called me and asked me to drive him to the courthouse. He knew exactly what forms he needed. He knew the filing fees. He had already called 3 attorneys before he settled on Margaret. Does that sound like a man who can't manage his own life?" The judge took notes. He didn't react. Then came the surprise witness. Margaret had subpoenaed the hospice nurse who had cared for Paul's wife in her final weeks. Her name was Diane. She had no involvement in the family dispute, no reason to favor either side. She testified under oath. Did you ever observe Mr. Anderson behaving in a confused or disoriented manner? Margaret asked. No, Diane said. He was always lucid. He knew his wife's medications better than I did. He kept a detailed log of her symptoms. He asked intelligent questions about her care. Did you ever observe any signs of dementia or cognitive decline? No. Did Sarah Anderson ever express concerns about her father's mental state to you? Diane paused. No, she actually told me she was worried about him being too involved in her mother's care. She wanted him to step back, but she never said he was confused or forgetful. Margaret turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit G. This is a phone record from the hospice agency showing that Sarah Anderson called to request that her mother be sedated more heavily during her final days. The nurse on duty refused, citing medical guidelines. The call log is time-stamped 2 days before Mrs. Anderson died. The courtroom went silent. David Strauss stood up. Objection, relevance. It goes to motive, Your Honor, Margaret said. The pattern of control extended to her mother's medical care, and when that failed, she turned on her father. The judge allowed the exhibit. Sarah sat motionless, her face pale. The hearing continued into a second day. Paul took the stand and testified for 2 hours. He answered every question directly, without hesitation. He explained his financial records. He explained his daily routine. He explained that he had no intention of giving up his independence, that he would fight this until the end. You want to know what I remember, Paul said at one point. I remember the day my daughter was born. I remember changing her diapers. I remember teaching her to ride a bike. I remember paying for her college. And I remember standing on my porch in my funeral suit while she watched me through the window. That's what I remember, and I'm not confused about any of it. The judge closed the hearing and said he would issue a ruling within 30 days. Paul waited. It was the longest month of his life. During that time, Margaret continued gathering evidence. She uncovered something that would change everything. Sarah had taken out a life insurance policy on her mother 6 months before she died. She was the sole beneficiary. The payout was $200,000, and according to the policy application, the mother had signed it while under heavy sedation. Margaret also found a receipt for a safe deposit box that Sarah had rented 2 days after the funeral. The bank records showed she had accessed it 3 times in the following week. When Margaret requested a court order to inspect the box, the judge granted it. Inside the box, $15,000 in cash, a set of diamond earrings that had belonged to Paul's wife, stock certificates worth $40,000, and a handwritten note that read, "Everything I have is mine. I earned it." It was Sarah's handwriting. On the 28th day, the judge issued his ruling. He denied the guardianship petition in full. He wrote that the evidence showed no basis for guardianship, that the petition had been filed in retaliation for the lockout reversal, and that Sarah's credibility had been severely damaged by her own testimony and the documentary evidence. But the judge didn't stop there. He ordered Sarah to return all assets she had taken from the house, the jewelry, the financial documents, the personal effects. He ordered her to pay Paul's legal fees, which totaled $43,000, and he referred the case to the county prosecutor for review of potential charges, including financial exploitation of an elder and filing a false guardianship petition. Paul walked out of the courthouse that day with his head high. He had his house back. He had his independence. He had his dignity. But the war wasn't over, because Sarah had one more card to play, and that card would land Paul in a courtroom he never expected to enter. The civil summons arrived on a Saturday morning, slipped under Paul's door like a threat. Sarah was suing him for conversion, claiming the jewelry and cash in the safe deposit box were gifts to her from her mother. She also filed for a restraining order, alleging Paul had threatened her outside the courthouse. There was no evidence, no witnesses, just her word against his. But a restraining order, even a temporary one, carries weight. If granted, Paul would have to stay away from his own daughter. He wouldn't be able to attend family gatherings. He wouldn't be able to defend himself at the upcoming criminal proceedings. It was a smear tactic designed to make him look dangerous. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. Paul walked into the courtroom with Margaret by his side. Sarah was already there, her lawyer David Strauss beside her. The judge was the same one who had denied the guardianship petition. He looked at the filing with visible skepticism. Strauss argued that Paul had a history of explosive anger. He pointed to the lockout incident, claiming Paul had shouted and pounded on the door. He played a snippet of a voicemail that Paul had left for Sarah after the lockout, a voicemail where Paul said, "You will regret this." Strauss called it a threat. Margaret countered with evidence. Paul had never been charged with any crime. He had no history of violence. The voicemail was a statement of consequence, not a threat. She argued that Sarah was using the legal system to harass and financially drain her father. The judge denied the restraining order, but he didn't dismiss the conversion lawsuit. That would go to trial in 6 months. Paul now faced 2 legal fronts: the criminal investigation into Sarah's conduct and a civil suit she had filed against him. But then came the discovery that changed everything. Paul's son Michael had been cleaning out his mother's closet when he found something taped to the underside of a dresser drawer. A small digital voice recorder, the kind used for dictation. The battery was dead. Michael charged it overnight. When he played the files, his blood ran cold. The recorder had been running for weeks before his mother's death. It had captured dozens of conversations in the bedroom, between Sarah and her mother, between Sarah and the hospice nurse, between Sarah and Paul. But one conversation stood out. It was recorded 3 days before the mother died. Sarah was alone with her mother. The mother's voice was weak but clear. "I want Paul to have the house," she said. "Everything is his. You'll be taken care of, but the house and the accounts are his." And then Sarah's voice, cold and sharp. "You don't know what you're saying. You're confused. I'll handle everything." The mother said, "I'm not confused. I know exactly what I want." Sarah said, "Sign this paper. It says I get the jewelry and the cash. Then we'll talk about the house." The mother said, "I'm not signing anything right now." Sarah said, "Then I'll tell the nurse you need a higher dose of morphine. You won't be able to sign anything ever again." The recording cut out. Michael brought the recorder to Margaret. She had it analyzed by a forensic audio expert. The voices were authenticated. The date and time stamps matched Sarah's known visits to the hospital. The recording was admissible evidence. Margaret immediately filed a motion to reopen the guardianship case, not for Paul, but for the estate. She argued that the recording proved Sarah had attempted to coerce her mother into changing her will under duress. She also shared the recording with the county prosecutor, who was already investigating Sarah for elder abuse. The prosecutor obtained a search warrant for Sarah's home. They seized her computers, phones, and financial records. What they found was a detailed spreadsheet tracking every asset her mother owned, with columns labeled "date secured" and estimated value. There was a folder of blank power of attorney forms, partially filled out with different dates. There was a list of passwords for her mother's online accounts. It was a deliberate, calculated plan to strip her parents of everything before they died. Sarah was arrested on a Tuesday morning at her home in front of her neighbors. The charges included theft from an elder adult, identity theft, filing false legal documents, and attempted coercion. Bail was set at $200,000. Sarah posted it within hours. Her husband sold his truck to raise the money. The arrest made the local news. The headline read, "Woman charged with exploiting dying mother locking out father." The community was stunned. Sarah had been a respected member of the local church, a volunteer at the school, a regular at the farmer's market. No one believed it, but the evidence was mounting. Paul didn't celebrate. He sat in his living room the night of the arrest, staring at the wall. Michael brought him coffee. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say. This was his daughter, the same little girl he had taught to ride a bike, the same young woman he had walked down the aisle, and now she was facing prison time for what she had done to her own mother. The criminal trial was scheduled for 9 months out. Paul would have to testify. He would have to sit in a courtroom and tell a jury how his daughter had manipulated her dying mother, had stolen from the family, had locked him out of his home. He would have to relive every betrayal. But first, there was the civil trial. Sarah's conversion lawsuit was still pending. She refused to drop it even after the arrest. Her lawyer argued that the recording did not prove conversion. It only proved a disagreement about gifts. The trial was set for July. Paul's legal fees were mounting. He had already spent over $60,000. His savings were depleted. He considered selling the house, the very house he had fought so hard to keep. Margaret told him to wait. The criminal case would resolve first, and if Sarah was convicted, the civil case would collapse. But waiting was its own kind of punishment. Every day, Paul woke up to the same empty house, the same silence, the same questions. He had lost his wife. He had almost lost his home. And now he was losing his daughter to a system she had created for herself. Then came the twist that no one saw coming. Sarah's attorney, David Strauss, withdrew from the case. He cited ethical concerns. In a court filing, he stated that his client had withheld material information from him and that he could no longer represent her in good faith. This was a devastating blow to Sarah's defense. Without a lawyer, she would have to represent herself or find new counsel at the last minute. The prosecutor saw an opportunity. They offered Sarah a plea deal: plead guilty to 1 count of exploitation, serve 3 years probation, return all stolen assets, and avoid jail time. Sarah refused. She insisted she had done nothing wrong. But without a lawyer, she was outmatched. The new attorney she hired was a criminal defense lawyer with little experience in elder law. He didn't understand the nuances of the evidence. He didn't know how to challenge the recording. He didn't know how to undermine the forensic accountant's report, which showed Sarah had taken over $250,000 from her mother's accounts in the final year. The trial began in September. It lasted 3 weeks. Paul testified for 2 days. He didn't break down. He answered every question. He told the jury about the lockout, about the guardianship petition, about the recording. He told them that he still loved his daughter, but that he couldn't protect her from the truth. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Sarah guilty on all 6 counts. At the sentencing hearing, the judge asked if Sarah had anything to say. She stood up and turned to face Paul. She said, "I did what I had to do. You were never there for Mom. You were never there for me. You deserved what you got." Paul looked at her. He didn't say a word. The judge sentenced Sarah to 18 months in state prison, followed by 5 years probation. She was ordered to repay every dollar she had taken, plus interest. She was ordered to undergo mental health treatment, and she was ordered to have no contact with her father for 10 years. The gavel fell. It was over. But for Paul, the silence that followed was heavier than any courtroom noise. He had won every battle. He had his house. He had his independence. He had the law on his side. But he had lost his daughter, and that was a loss no judge could reverse. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Paul walked through the rooms, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs that had been restored to their places. The empty spaces where his wife's things had been were filled again, piece by piece, recovered from Sarah's storage unit by court order. The jewelry came back. The cash came back. The stock certificates were reissued. But the silence in the kitchen at 7 p.m., the hour when his wife used to call him for dinner, that silence could not be returned. Paul had won the legal war, but the aftermath felt hollow. He had spent 18 months in a legal maze, fighting for rights he already owned. And now he sat alone in a house that held 40 years of memories. each room a reminder of what had been taken and what could never be restored. But something unexpected happened in the months after the trial. The community rallied. People who had known Paul for decades began showing up with casseroles, with invitations to dinner, with offers to help with yard work. The man who had been isolated by his daughter's campaign of control found himself surrounded by neighbors who had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to intervene. One evening, a neighbor named Robert, who lived 3 doors down, knocked on Paul's door. Robert was a retired postal worker, a quiet man who kept to himself. He carried a small envelope. "I found this in my garage," he said. "It was taped to the bottom of a box your daughter dropped off at my house 2 years ago. She asked me to hold it for her. I forgot about it until last week." Paul opened the envelope. Inside was a deed. Not a copy, the original, signed by his wife, dated 6 months before her death. It transferred the house from joint ownership to Sarah alone. The signature was shaky. The notary stamp was from a notary Paul had never heard of. And the date on the document was a date when Paul's wife had been in the hospital, heavily sedated. Paul called Margaret the next morning. She had the deed examined by a document expert. The signature was determined to be a forgery. The notary, when located, admitted that Sarah had brought the document to her and claimed her mother had signed it at home. The notary had not witnessed the signature. That was a felony. Margaret turned the deed over to the prosecutor, who reopened the investigation. Sarah, now serving her 18-month sentence, was charged with forgery and tampering with a government record. She faced an additional 2 to 5 years. The irony was devastating. Sarah could have walked away with probation. She had refused the plea deal. Now she was facing double the time, all because she had hidden a forged deed that no one would have found if she had simply let it go. Meanwhile, Paul began the slow work of rebuilding. He joined a grief support group at his church. He started volunteering at the local food bank. He began seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma. The therapist told him something that stuck. "You didn't lose your daughter. You lost the daughter you thought you had. The person she became is not your failure to fix. It's her choice to own." Paul let those words settle. He started sleeping through the night again. He started answering the phone when people called. He started planning a trip to visit his son Michael out west, a trip he had postponed for years. But the deepest wound remained. The Christmas after the trial, Paul sat alone in his house, looking at the tree he had decorated by himself. Michael called from Colorado. They talked for an hour. Michael asked if his father was okay. Paul said he was okay, that he was learning to be alone. "Dad," Michael said, "you're not alone. You have me. You have the neighbors. You have people who care about you. The only person who isn't here is the one who chose not to be." Paul didn't say anything, but he felt the truth of it. 6 months later, a letter arrived at Paul's house. The return address was a state prison. Paul opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single page, handwritten in Sarah's neat script. "Dad, I know you might not read this, but I need to say something. I was wrong. I don't know when I became the person who could do those things. I look back and I don't recognize myself. I wanted control. I wanted security. I wanted to feel like I mattered. And I hurt you and Mom to get it. I am sorry. I am truly sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I know what I did. I am in therapy. I am trying to understand. I don't know what my future looks like, but I hope it includes a chance to be your daughter again someday." Paul read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of his wife's nightstand. He didn't write back. Not yet, but he kept the letter. The final resolution came a year after Sarah's release on parole. She completed a restorative justice program, which included writing to victims of similar crimes and speaking at community centers about elder exploitation. She worked at a nonprofit that helped families navigate guardianship abuse. She bought a small apartment across town. She did not ask to see Paul. But one Sunday afternoon, Paul received a call. The caller ID showed Sarah's name. He answered. "Dad," her voice was shaky. Sarah, I don't want anything. I just wanted to hear your voice. I wanted to say I love you. I know I don't have the right to say that anymore, but it's true. And I wanted you to know that I am not the same person who changed those locks. I am trying every day to be someone you could be proud of. Paul was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I am proud of you for trying. That's a start. They talked for 20 minutes. It was awkward and painful and raw, but it was real. They started meeting for coffee once a month. The conversations were careful at first, full of pauses and unspoken grief. But over time, something fragile and new began to grow. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was the beginning of a bridge that had been burned to ash. Paul's story became something unexpected. Margaret Chen told it at legal conferences as a cautionary tale about elder abuse. A local journalist wrote an article about the case, and it was picked up by national publications. Paul received letters from strangers who had been through similar experiences, asking how he survived, how he kept going. He wrote back to every one of them. His answer was simple: I kept going because there was no other option. You do not have to be strong, you just have to keep showing up. The law can give you your house back, but only time can give you your peace. In the end, Paul did not get a Hollywood ending. He did not reunite with his daughter in a perfect embrace. The damage was too deep for that, but he got something that mattered more. He got his life back. He got to sit on his porch and watch the sunset over the oak tree he had planted 40 years ago. He got to laugh with his son and his grandchildren when they visited. He got to know with certainty that he had done the right thing, even when it cost him everything. And that was enough. That was the only ending that mattered. Paul's story is not unique. It happens in every city, every town, every family that believes greed could never touch them. The daughter who locked out her father, the guardian who steals from the vulnerable, the will that gets rewritten under pressure, the silence of people who suspect but don't want to get involved. These stories play out behind closed doors every single day. And the law, as shown here, can restore what was taken, but it cannot restore what was broken. The deeper question this story leaves us with is not about legal strategy or courtroom tactics. It is about how families fall apart, how love twists into control, how grief becomes an opportunity, how the person you raised can become unrecognizable, and how sometimes there is a path back. It is fragile. It takes years. It requires accountability, humility, and a willingness to sit in the discomfort of what happened. Paul found his way through. He did not become bitter. He did not let the betrayal define him. He let the community in. He let himself grieve. And he left the door open, just a crack, for the possibility of something new. That is the hardest part of any betrayal. Not the fight, not the court case, not the money. It is the choice to keep living without letting the wound become your identity. Paul made that choice. And in doing so, he proved that the human spirit is stronger than any lock, any forged deed, any sentence handed down by a judge. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who might be sitting in the same silence Paul sat in, wondering if anyone else has survived this kind of pain. The answer is yes. The answer is right here. Subscribe for more stories of justice, resilience, and the quiet courage of ordinary people fighting for what matters. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to give up on yourself and on the people you love, even when they have given up on you.